UFOs and the Christian destruction of human knowledge. The Gnostic form of Christianity was declared heresy at the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, where what became the common antecedent of both the Orthodox and the Roman Catholic Church selected what scriptures would be considered canonical and branded the rejected texts and their doctrines as anathema. This council was called by the Roman Caesar Constantine, who a decade earlier had converted to Christianity after a striking close encounter. In 312 AD, while marching at the head of his troops, Constantine and his men saw a brightly shining cross-shaped UFO in the late afternoon sky. Constantine basically turned to his men and asked them, "Are you seeing what I'm seeing?" They all replied in the affirmative, and they were as shocked at the vision as the emperor was. While gazing at the hovering and illuminated cruciform object, Constantine thought he saw inscribed on it in Latin the word "in this conquer." The following night, while in bed, he was visited by Christ in either a dream or a vision, and Jesus personally instructed him to make a banner with the symbol of the cross on it as a guarantee of victory in battle. These experiences compelled Constantine to legalize Christianity, which had been banned by the Roman Catholic state, and to even put the weight of the government behind it. This set the stage for Christianity being declared the official religion of the Roman Empire by Caesar Theodosius I at the end of the 4th century AD. It is under his reign that, based on the Nicene Creed established by the Church with the backing of Constantine, all heretics began to be persecuted. The worst of the atrocities committed in the name of the new religion under the reign of Theodosius was his approval of the destruction of the Library of Alexandria and more generally of the higher intellectual culture of classical antiquity, together with the academies, libraries, and laboratories that sustained scientific research, technical innovation, and literary production. Alexandria was a Greek colony established in Egypt and named after Alexander of Macedon. Aristotle personally tutored Alexander, who went on to reverse the power dynamic between the Greeks and the Persians and to colonize not only the core of the Persian Empire, but Egypt and northern India as well. Alexander died young, at the age of 33, in Babylon, before having a chance to secure the long-term political unity of his new empire. Alexander's generals divided up his empire after his death. Nevertheless, his dream of establishing a cosmopolitan world civilization was realized in some measure, insofar as the cultural milieu that he created with his conquests allowed for a hybridization of the Greek way of life and thought with cultures of the colonized peoples to produce what is known as Hellenistic versus Hellenic civilization. The cultural capital of this cosmopolitan civilization was Alexandria in Egypt. The territory had fallen under the command of General Ptolemy, who went on to establish his own Ptolemaic dynasty there. The Ptolemies were great patrons of the arts and sciences, in many ways establishing the model of aristocratic patronage of the quest for knowledge and technical innovation that was resurrected by the Medici family and others during the Italian Renaissance. Numerous scholars from Athens and elsewhere in the classical world were drawn to the museum that Ptolemy established in Alexandria. This museum, or temple dedicated to the Muses, featured a library that, by some estimates, contained some 500,000 scrolls. The Ptolemies even forced ships docking at the port of Alexandria from the far corners of the Hellenistic world to turn over any books that they might have on board to be copied by the librarians of the museum before they could resume their journeys. Among the hundreds of thousands of scrolls in the Library of Alexandria was the work of Aristarchus of Samos, 310 to 230 BCE, who, working in the Pythagorean tradition, had rejected the Platonic and Aristotelian model of the cosmos and devised a heliocentric model of the solar system that correctly placed the Earth in orbit around the Sun. Meanwhile, a geographer and mathematician by the name of Eratosthenes, 235 BCE, who headed the Library of Alexandria himself, had managed to calculate the Earth's circumference to within a very small margin of error of the number that we now know to be correct. Eratosthenes arrived at the figure of 252,000 states or 24,000 miles, strikingly close to the true number 24,901. Consistent with the Alexandrian spirit, on the basis of his discoveries concerning the dimensions of the spherical Earth, Eratosthenes not only argued that it could be circumnavigated by sailors, but also that such voyages could act to demolish racial prejudices and promote universal human brotherhood. We know that among other eclectic cultural influences, Babylonian astrology and astronomy made it to Alexandria and was assimilated by Greek astronomers in such a way as to effect a fundamental advance that left obsession with aesthetic considerations, such as the geometrical form of the cosmos, behind in favor of more accurate quantitative measurements and predictions of celestial phenomena. It also spurred the design of high-precision instruments geared to this purpose. By the 1st century BCE, a device designed to measure the apparent diameter of the sun and moon, the astrolabe, with its stereographic projection, had been invented. The precession of the equinoxes that had been discovered and the rising and setting times of the major constellations at a given locations had been determined, together with times of the equinoxes and solstices. Such advances in knowledge, facilitated by technological innovation, not only afforded the Hellenistic peoples more accurate calendars, but also allowed for the compiling of massive star catalogs or atlases of heavens. These would draw on observations going back hundreds of years to calculate the average length of the lunar month to within 1 second of modern value, and to predict solar and lunar eclipses for any given location. Although Aristarchus had grasped that the earth actually revolves around the sun, his heliocentric model had less predictive power than the most sophisticated refinement of the earth-centered one. The Alexandrian astronomer Claudius Ptolemy, 150 CE, introduced a number of innovations to the Platonic/Aristotelian model of the cosmos to arrive at the system that would not be overthrown until the Copernican revolution in the 16th century. Ptolemy, not to be confused with the general and founder of the dynasty, was answering a challenge that is supposed to have been first posed by Plato, namely whether the occasionally retrograde motion of the planets and the variations in the speed that they undergo in their apparent orbits around the Earth could somehow be translated into a composite of uniform and perfectly circular motions. Yet, while perfection of the celestial realm, of the same kind that seduced Parmenides into thinking that the one must be spherical in shape, Ptolemy would have to carry out this task in a way that retained the new standard of quantitative precision in predictive power that was set by the Hellenistic assimilation of Babylonian astronomical techniques. We must also bear in mind that the kind of trigonometry used to make accurate predictions in this epoch could not readily be applied to shapes other than circles. Advances in astronomy are obviously also going to call for breakthroughs in optics. Early in the Alexandrian period, Euclid, 300 BCE, developed optics to a science that drew on the geometrical principles of the elements, for which he is most famous. In a propositional form similar to that of his earlier and more widely known work, Euclid's Optica analyzed an object's appearance based on its spatial relationship to the observer, with special emphasis on the geometrical cone of vision, which is based on the visible object and its vertex on the eye of the perceiver. Rays extending from the vertex to the object at various angles mark the elements of the first scientific theory of perspective, or the apparent size of an object viewed as a function of the angle from which it is perceived. This is a development with significant psychological implications, considering the broader connotation of perspectival perception in the context of the rising cosmopolitan intercultural context of the Greeks in the wake of Alexander's conquest. In fact, Claudius Ptolemy was actually working at the museum in Alexandria when he used Euclid's groundwork to elaborate a more sophisticated optical science. Again, we are dealing with an astronomer who is elaborating optics for the purpose of astronomical observation. In his Optica, Ptolemy did not restrict himself to Euclid's narrow geometrical approach. Rather, Ptolemy's theory of vision included explicit consideration of these physiological and psychological dimensions of the visual process in a way that allowed for experimental tests with quantitative results. Although he adopts Euclid's cone of vision, he extends it to account for both monocular and binocular vision and interprets its rays as physically real. These rays take on the color of objects and transmit visual information on the shape, size, and location of objects back to the brain of the perceiver. Most impressively, Ptolemy develops a comprehensive account of reflection and refraction in surfaces such as mirrors and bodies of water, formulating equations that accurately project, for example, by exactly what angle a stick will appear bent undergoes when it is refracted in water, or how an image will be distorted with both concave and convex mirrors of spherical or cylindrical shape. Optics was by no means the only area of scientific experimentation in the Hellenistic milieu of Alexandrian civilization. It only stands to reason that mechanics would yield the greatest hands-on efforts in the laboratory and ones that would lead most directly to technological innovation. Drawing from mechanical problems considered by the school of Aristotle, Archimedes, 287 to 212 BCE, laid out the principles of mechanics in the form of Euclidean proofs and the way in which he mathematized nature in terms of the dynamical movement of the parts of things set an example that, while it fell on deaf ears throughout the Middle Ages, would be a powerful influence on the founders of the modern science. Archimedes is said to have designed machines capable of lifting naval vessels out of water and burning these ships using focused beams of light produced by an array of mirrors. Researchers at Alexandria cited his work extensively and used it for their own mechanical inventions. One of these was Hero of Alexandria, who designed the first steam engine and gear train. He also wrote a treatise on robotics. The cosmopolitan atmosphere of Alexandria made it possible for the Ptolemies to break with conservative Greek funerary traditions in allowing human autopsies at the laboratories of the museum and library beginning in the 3rd century BCE, which led to vital advances in medicine and biological science. Hippocrates of Kos, 460 to 370 BCE, is actually regarded as the founder of Greek medicine in a formal sense, although physicians such as Aristotle's father had been practicing for centuries before his time. It is to Hippocrates that we owe the Hippocratic oath of modern medical practice. Beginning with Hippocrates, Caesar producing diseases such as epilepsy and cerebral palsy, which had been seen as the product of being seized by a god, were given naturalistic explanations. A very conscious attempt was made to put witch doctors, faith healers, quacks, and charlatans out of business by establishing standards of formal medical study and private practice. As in pre-Socratic physics, the key turn here was toward naturalistic accounts that assume that nature acts uniformly and according to universal principles that are not subject to the caprice of supernatural entities. Within this framework, disease is often diagnosed as some imbalance in the body due to an interference with its natural state, such as blockages of veins or the overabundance or dearth of some bodily fluid or humor. Standard examination procedures were established, including the examination of the patient's face, eyes, hands, posture, breathing, sleep, and emissions and excretions from all bodily orifices. These serve not only to diagnose the disease responsible for symptoms such as coughing, sneezing, fever, convulsions, tumors, and lesions, but also to discern the pathology of the disease in question so as to offer a prognosis on its probable future course. In addition to diagnosis and prognosis, classical physicians were of course also in the business of treating various ailments, especially with the regulation of diet, exercise, sleep, and sex, special baths and massages, and hundreds of herbal medicines used as laxatives, purgatives, emetics, narcotics, expectorants, balms, and powders. The Greeks, who inaugurated the Olympic Games, founded many of the sports still practiced in Western civilization, and so sports medicine was a key part of the practice of physicians. Modern physicians have been quite impressed with the skill with which their Greek predecessors administered treatment of wounds, fractures, and dislocations. Despite the emphasis on naturalistic diagnosis, we must remember that Greeks as brilliant as Plato and Aristotle understood nature very differently from modern materialists, and so practices such as dream healing remained an important part of Hellenistic medicine. Unfortunately, Greek medical writings of Alexandrian period seem to have been among the greatest casualties of the Holocaust of the writings of classical antiquity, epitomized by the burning of the Library of Alexandria, the city whose relatively liberal atmosphere allowed medical practice to advance most rapidly. We have considerable writings from the early Greek medical practice centered on places such as Athens, and then there is a black hole in our knowledge until the early Christian period. We are often left to reconstruct the brilliant innovations of the intervening period from later and often biased authors. Two of the most accomplished physicians of the Hellenistic period were actually based in Alexandria. Herophilus, circa 255 BCE, a native of Asia Minor, came to Alexandria to work under the patronage of the first two sovereigns of the Ptolemaic dynasty. Galen, who was born in 129 CE at Pergamum, another center of learning in the classical world, traveled widely in the Asia Minor, Corinth, and the Greek mainland before settling in Alexandria during the most productive phase of his career. He would go on to become the most personal physician of the famous Roman gladiators and three Caesars in Rome, Marcus Aurelius, Commodus, and Septimius Severus. The aforementioned legality of human autopsy in colonial Alexandria under the Ptolemies, which broke with traditional Greek and Roman religious customs, allowed these men to make tremendous advances in anatomy. They mapped the brain and nervous system, including its connections with the spinal cord, distinguished veins from arteries in the head, and carefully examined the function of its valves. They described the ovaries and fallopian tubes, laying the foundation for the practice of obstetrics. Galen is known to have even carried out brain surgery. Great physicians such as Herophilus, Erasistratus, and Galen did not go unchallenged. While they were respected by those who studied their works, both their method and their findings were also challenged by independent investigations that yielded a healthy debate in the scientific literature of the Hellenistic period. When in 307 BCE, Demetrius Phaleron, a student of Aristotle's Lyceum, was overthrown as dictator of Athens, a city with a strong democratic tradition and one whose democracy had sentenced Socrates to death, Demetrius was invited to Alexandria by Ptolemy and probably influenced the latter's plans to establish his own center of learning there. It would become the intellectual beacon of the entire classical world, a spiritual complement of Alexandria's famous lighthouse, until the classical Caesar of the Roman Empire ushered in the Dark Ages. Roman emperors such as Antonius Pius and Marcus Aurelius endowed imperial chairs for teachers of philosophy. Caesar Marcus Aurelius, reigned 218 to 222 CE, an accomplished philosopher himself, endowed chairs for each of the four major schools of thought: the Platonic, the Peripatetic, Aristotelian, and Epicurean schools. All competitors to his own Stoic path to knowledge were equally encouraged by him. The extraordinary intellectual culture of the Hellenistic period, centered on Alexandria, was brought to an end with the Judeo-Christian takeover of the Roman Empire. In the first third of the 4th century CE, around the year 235, the Caesar Constantine adopted the Christian religion and convened a council at Nicaea to organize the fractious religion into an established church with a clearly defined canon and dogma. The city of New Rome was named Constantinople in his honor and became the capital of the Christian Eastern Roman Empire, or Byzantium. Within a generation of Constantine's Christianization of Roman Empire, which established a persecuted fringe cult as the official state religion, Bishop Cyril of Alexandria was waging a vicious campaign to establish Christian dominance over this beacon of scientific learning in the pagan world. At that time, Hypatia of Alexandria, 335 to 405 CE, was the director of the Neoplatonic Academy in the city, and in that capacity, a key guardian of his museum and library. That such a status was attainable by a woman at that time in human history, and thanks to Christianity, not again for more than 1500 years, attests to the extraordinarily progressive and humanistic cultural milieu of Alexandrian civilization. Although she was very attractive and garnered many suitors, Hypatia was more interested in pursuing scientific exploration than in the household duties of a married woman. Cyril saw her as an epitome of pagan impiety, not only because she was an independent woman with a prominent position in the public sphere, but also because she was so accomplished in the sciences, which the rising Judeo-Christian church viewed as worldly vanity by comparison to the content of his revealed scriptures. Cyril accused Hypatia of witchcraft on account of her work with the celestial instruments, such as the astrolabe. Under Cyril's orders, Hypatia was seized by a Christian mob on her way home, stripped naked and flayed to death. Her skin was scraped off her flesh with shards of pottery and seashells until she bled to death. Then they took her corpse and tossed it on a pyre in a herald of the future witch burnings. The Christian mob went on to burn the Library of Alexandria to the ground and to smash the idols of Serapium, the temple to Serapis, the patron deity of the museum and library, whose cult the Ptolemies had set up as a synthesis of Greek and Egyptian beliefs. 500,000 scrolls went up in flames. What we know of the accomplishment of classical antiquity in the arts and sciences, such as the voluminous writings of all Greek dramatists, the pre-Socratics, Plato and Aristotle, is about 1% of what was contained in the library and at other sites that suffered similar, albeit less dramatic fates during the rise of the Church of Rome. That percentage has been calculated based on the detailed study of every textual reference on the art of classical authors and writers of the early Christian period, to books that did not survive into the Middle Ages, or to authors whose entire corpus of writings perished in the Christian cultural genocide of European civilization. Bishop Cyril was canonized as a saint, so the classical age ended and the medieval Dark Ages of Europe began. It began specifically under the reign of Emperor Justinian, who from 540 to 592 carried out a series of reforms that even more deeply institutionalized Christianity. During this period, there were many UFO sightings across Europe and an outbreak of the plague, which, taken together, convinced people to accept the totalitarian theocratic policies of Justinian as a bulwark against the evident wrath of God. They just wanted it all to stop, and Justinian, whose policies might otherwise have been resisted, was able to capitalize on this by offering his even more oppressively anti-intellectual vision of Christian theocracy as a purification that would appease the Heavenly Father. What displays of wrath of God has so terrified the populace? For example, before the plague would break out in an area, people saw lights dancing in the sky at night that were so bright that they would illuminate the ground more intensely than the sun does at daytime. One sighting, which took place in Rome itself during these years, was an immense dragon, that floated slowly through the sky above the city before plunging down into the sea, at which point an outbreak of plague began. As we shall see, these were just heralds of future, close encounters that would bring a far worse plague to ravage Europe during the late medieval era. When Justinian closed all of the last remaining academies in the empire, their philosophers and scientists took refuge in the neighboring Persian Empire. There, at places such as Academy of Gondeshapur, they continued their work. Of course, the UFO overlords could not have this. So within less than a century, Iran was also targeted by a new version of Abrahamic revelation, version 3.0 as it were. I have written about the relationship of Muhammad to UFOs and about Islam as a product of close encounters elsewhere. For that reason, and also in the interest of not being diverted from tracing a coherent historical trajectory that demonstrates the catastrophic impact of close encounters on the level of scientific knowledge and technical culture in Western civilization, I will only briefly point out some of the key facts here. First of all, on the night that Muhammad received the first revelation of the Quran, he saw a UFO outside of the cave where he was confronted by the angel Gabriel. Second, Muhammad received the surahs of the Quran telepathically as a medium, in the same manner of many of the UFO contactees of the 1950s and 60s. He often did not know what he himself was saying, which makes this similar to the case of the prophet Ezekiel. With Muhammad as well, one gets the sense of a ventriloquist dummy who is being handled by the UFO's pilots. Third, according to the hadith or recorded oral traditions from the close companions of the Prophet, during his childhood, Muhammad was abducted by beautiful men who were seen opening up his body and removing his internal organs, which glowed after they were cleaned with something, before being placed back inside his stomach and chest cavity, which was sealed up the way that the bodies of abductees subjected to prostitutes are sealed up today. Fourth, these same mysterious men, would occasionally show up during the prophetic career of Muhammad, and he would go sit with them in a circle inside of a tent that no one else was allowed to enter. Fifth, Muhammad was taken up into the night sky on some kind of aerial conveyance called a burak, then appeared to have time distortion effects, and that flew him first to the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, and then from there straight up into the stars, where he supposedly met prior prophets such as Moses and Jesus, and even had a conversation with God, albeit from behind a Wizard of Oz style curtain that stood between him and the throne of the Almighty. Sixth, Muhammad prevailed against incredible odds during military campaigns such as the Battle of Badr, because he had help from an army of angels who swept down onto the battlefield from a cloud and decapitated enemy soldiers, in some cases while being cloaked with invisibility. All of this amounts to a classical profile of someone chosen, for prophethood by the shining stupidity, inside the UFO. In this case, the Islamic conquest of the Persian Empire ensured that the light of knowledge, which had been snuffed out by Constantine, Theodosius, and Justinian in Europe, could not find a long-term refuge in Iran. In the mid to late 13th century, the intellectual life of Europe had begun to make a comeback, and more cultured aspects of medieval society, such as chivalry, music, art, and architecture, were beginning to prevail over barbaric brutality and church-enforced ignorance. What eventually came to be known as the Renaissance was about to take place 2 or 3 centuries earlier. Then, from 1347 to 1350, the Black Death struck Europe, not only halting this process, but reversing it. It is believed by establishment scholars that this worst of all plagues, which was a combination of bubonic and pneumonic plague, was carried by rodents, and that its spread was facilitated by wintry weather. The problem is that there are many accounts of the plague breaking out during these years in places where there was no rodent infestation, and also during the summer months. The plague also seemed to suddenly strike isolated areas which had no contact with other regions that were already afflicted. William Bramley, who took a closer look at first-hand historical accounts of the outbreaks, found a much more disturbing cause and etiology. The majority of the eyewitness reports of plague outbreaks feature two closely related phenomena. First, before the plague would break out somewhere, strange and intensely bright lights were seen moving around in the night sky in that area. For lack of a better word, the medieval authors described these as comets, but it is clear from the details of the descriptions that these objects moved upwards just as often as they descended or flew horizontally, and they would also sometimes hover, over a town or city, bathing the area below them in intensely white light. Sometimes they appeared to have regular flight paths, such as when these objects flew back and forth between Whitehall and St. James just before the plague broke out in London. Second, a thick mist would appear in connection with these luminous aerial phenomena, and it was the inhalation of these foul-smelling, mists by certain people that would often initiate an outbreak of the plague. In this connection, Bramley notes that our military-grade germ warfare weapons are aerosolized, with the deadly pathogen being spread by just such a mist, released at the detonation of a biowarfare device. Third, and most disturbingly, strange men garbed in black were seen in connection with these lights and these mists. They would often be sighted in the fields with a device that reminded locals of a scythe, but which did not actually cut the wheat that it was supposed to plow through. These men would move through a field in groups of dozen or so, and would continue their dreadful work in a dedicated and undistracted manner, even when large groups of the local townspeople would gather to watch them in horror. The plague would promptly break out in an area after these terrifying men were sighted reaping, the local wheat fields. Again, without actually cutting any oats. They were undoubtedly spraying the fields in those devices. The men appeared to have masks, which gave naive witnesses the impression of second heads that were dangling by their hips. No doubt these were gas masks. These men would even on occasion go door to door with their scythe-shaped devices, knocking and sweeping at the door with these instruments, perhaps spreading the plague from household to household as the terrified denizens locked themselves indoors throughout the night. Inevitably, those within the house that was targeted would die of the plague shortly thereafter. It is the image of this mysterious plague-bearing men in black that became the basis of the European folk symbol of the Grim Reaper. In addition to these men, who became the basis for the image of the Reaper, ugly little goblins, were also seen in plague-stricken areas. These goblins, would harass and terrify people. Fourth and finally, victims who died of the plague would exhale a blue mist as they gave up the ghost. This same blue mist would be seen collecting toward the ceilings of tall rooms, such as under ceilings of the chapel in churches. This last item suggests a pathogen of nanotechnological rather than merely a biological nature. It has to be borne in mind that UFOs have been associated with spreading of plagues ever since the time of Moses and the plagues that the Elohim directed against the Egyptians. As we have seen, ancient Sumerian texts also claim that the Anunnaki used plagues to decimate the human population from time to time. In the case of the Black Death, the UFO pilots claimed the lives of anywhere between 25 and 40 million people, which represents 1/3 to 1/2 of the population of Europe at the time. On top of the death toll, there were social consequences of this genocide that were at least equally appalling. It plunged the society progressing toward the Renaissance back into the worst kind of God-fearing superstition, guilt over sins that had incurred the wrath of God, apocalyptic despair, mass hysteria, and attendant persecution of scapegoat minorities. One can rightly ask why it was that the European Renaissance was eventually allowed to take place at all, even if a couple of centuries later than it might have. The answer may go back to the fact that there are two factions of civilization with UFO technology, the so-called Devas and Asuras, or angels and demons. Are these the descendants of the futurists and the traditionalists that already represented a dichotomy in the time-traveling breakaway civilization at its inception? It appears that the demons, or titanic Prometheans, defended the Renaissance in Europe. That is the impression that one gets from the two massive aerial battles that were witnessed by hundreds of people in the skies over European cities during the Renaissance. On April 14, 1561, hundreds of people in Nuremberg, Germany, saw red, blue, and black spheres flying in the sky at sunrise, together with larger pipes, or cylindrical objects that also hovered over the city. Judging from the woodblock prints illustrating the event in one of the broadsheets of the time, the cylinders appeared to be releasing the smaller spheres. There was also a single gigantic black object, larger than all of the other ones, and shaped like something between an elongated triangle and a spear. which hovered over the city. These objects started fighting against each other on the course, and their ferocious battle lasted for an hour, at which point certain of the objects fell onto the earth as if everything was burning, and with great smoke everything got consumed on the course. 5 years later, on August 7, 1566, at the height of the Renaissance, the sky at sunrise over Basel, Switzerland was filled with black spheres. These would fly around at high speed and make sudden turns to change direction as they engaged one another in what the hundreds of astonished witnesses of the event described as an aerial battle. When any of the spheres was hit by the others, it would turn a fiery red and then disintegrate in mid-air. A detailed visual depiction of the event was recorded by an engraving that shows the people of Basel marveling at these objects in the sky over the cathedral.